Good morning. Good morning. Hello. There we are. I have found my voice. I'd like to welcome you this morning. Dr. Delron Shirley is director of the third-year mission school at Charis Bible College in Woodland Park, Colorado. He believes in turning theory into practice by sending his mission school students on extended cross-cultural mission experiences. In addition to directing the mission school, Delron also teaches first and second year courses. Dr. Shirley is founder and president of Teach All Nations. Teach All Nations makes him and his wife Peggy thoroughly busy throughout the year, where they teach at conferences and national pastors and leaders throughout the world. In addition to the ministry to the nation, Delron and Peggy are strongly committed to inspiring others to go beyond their borders, to share the good news. Thus, they lead several mission trips throughout the year and introduce teams of students to live on the mission fields. Dr. Shirley also serves as a consultant for Every Home for Christ in their discipleship department. And before moving to Colorado, how is it said? Colorado. Dr. Shirley served for 25 years as Dean of World Harvest Bible College and Indiana Christian University. In 1988, that became part of Lester L. Summerall's Evangelistic Association. And if there ever was ministry envy, he also worked as a chaplain at Yosemite National Park. What a job that would be. Dr. Shirley.
Thank you. All right. Thank you so much. This is a great privilege to be here with you in Toronto. In our last classes that we've had, we are still talking about Israel as the key to human destiny. And I shared with you a number of different points. One of the things that we talked about was the fact that Israel is the heritage of Abraham, and that Abraham was called by God and given a covenant. Several elements to that covenant included the fact that he was going to have a land, a special land that was his own. It would be a great nation that would develop. Abraham himself would have a great name. And he says, everyone that blesses you will be blessed. Everyone that curses you will be cursed. And that I'm giving you this land as far as you can see, the north, the south, the east, and the west. And then we had some boundaries that we talked about, how that God set that as an eternal boundary. And then also that he says, in your offspring will be as numerable as the sand of the sea. And then God not only gave that promise to him once, but he reconfirmed it. And God said, I want you to make a sacrifice, put animals on the ground, and that was a traditional sacrifice confirmation that was used at that period of time in history. And the thing that would happen is that once that the animals were sacrificed, that both parties that were part of the covenant would walk through that bloody path between the parts of the animals. But God didn't require Abraham to walk through. God, in the form of a smoking pot, appeared and went through that, making it a unilateral covenant from God's side only, not a bilateral from God and Abraham's side. But he said that for Abraham, he had a requirement to stay there all night to protect the carcasses from being eaten by the ravaging birds. And the process of that means that there's a covenant, but it's going to be attacked throughout all history. And that the Jewish people who are going to be the recipients of that covenant have to protect their covenant. And then we've talked about how that all through history there has been one after another attempt to take that covenant away from the people, to take that land and the blessing away from them. And then God then asked Abraham then to make a sign on his part to prove that he was going to be a recipient to that covenant, and he honored that covenant, and that was circumcision. And so all the Jewish people from that point of history to today, receive the circumcision mark as proof that they are connected to the covenant promises of God. God also said that it was to Abraham and his seed. And Paul makes it very clear when we get into the New Testament in the book of Galatians that seed is one seed, not seeds plural. The point being that there's one heir in every generation, but it's multi-generational. And then we talked about how that Isaac was the first recipient, and then Isaac was not the older son. There was Ishmael before him. And then that Jacob was the next recipient. Jacob was not the older son. Esau was the older son. And that God seemed to be breaking the human pattern, because the human pattern would be that it would always be the oldest son in a family that would be primogenitor. He would be the one who would receive the covenant promises of his own father. But God said, I'm showing you that out of my graciousness, I pick the person that's going to be the recipient. And Jacob, to me, is very interesting because he was a cheat, he was a scoundrel, he was a schemer, he was a deceiver. He would not be the one that I would ever give the covenant promise to. But God said, he's my man. And he passed it on to him, a demonstration of grace, God's grace, even in the Old Testament. And so, but Jacob was picked, and even though that he took the promise, he took the covenant by deception, God then appears to him personally to confirm that the covenant promise is his. Interestingly enough, it's in Jacob that we see that the covenant promise of God actually was in two parts. There was a physical part that he took from his brother Esau on the day that the brother came home saying, I'm about to starve to death, and I see you're cooking soup. Can you give me some soup? And Jacob says, well, we can negotiate on that. And he said, what price do you want? And he says, oh, just a simple price, everything you own. And he said, I want your birthright, which meant all of the physical inheritance that he was going to receive. So he took that in the first negotiation, and then later, through the deception, he took the spiritual covenant part of the covenant part of the promises, the spiritual part. So, from that point on, we have to be aware that the covenant promises of God, actually there's a physical dimension and a spiritual dimension. The physical dimension is what we're talking about, that the Jewish people are to be given the land of Israel, that land, that little spot of land on the Mediterranean Sea. Interesting to me, and we didn't mention this in the lesson when we were talking about it. You look at any world map, you will never see the word Israel written on the spot of color that represents the nation. It's always written in the Mediterranean Sea, and maybe a little arrow or whatever pointing to it. Because on any world map, it is so small that they don't have room to put the name of the country on the name. Wow. Such a tiny little place, but yet it is so significant in history and in current events and in prophecy. You can't get away from its significance, even though it is such a small little place. But anyway, that's the physical covenant promise. And then there's a spiritual covenant promise. And sometimes we get confused because the spiritual is passed on to the Christian church. But the Christian church doesn't have any claim to the physical land of Israel. So there's a separate part of the mention that's there. Okay, so we had Jacob. And then after Jacob, it would seem that the next heir is going to be Joseph. Joseph was apparently Jacob's favorite son. He was the only one that got a coat of many colors. And so we see that he seemed to be pampered. He seemed to be privileged. And the brothers were jealous, and the brothers sold him into slavery. when he went into Egypt, then there was a separation from the covenant land. Before that time, there was always a determination not to leave the covenant land. Jacob had to flee from the covenant land when his brother Esau was threatening his life. But as soon as he was ready to cross the border to go away, God appeared to him in the night in a vision and said, I'm going to bring you back. This is a covenant land. You're coming back to that covenant land. Isaac, when he was old enough to get married, Abraham sent a servant to find a decent wife, the proper wife, a godly wife for him. And the servant said, well, what if I don't find somebody that's willing to come here? And he said, well, in that case, the deal is off. That's a deal breaker right there. She's got to come live here because I am not sending him out of the land. It was a revelation that you had to be in the covenant land. And so Joseph winds up living in Egypt. But when we read the story of Joseph in the New Testament, in the book of Hebrews, in Hebrews 11, when it tells us about all the great men of faith, when it gets to Joseph, it says Joseph by faith made the people swear that they would bring his bones back and bury them in Israel. And you say, duh. He's the guy who fed all the nations and did all this stuff. And man, can't you find something better to qualify him as a man of faith? But no, the thing that qualified him as a man of faith was that he understood his covenant relationship, that he had a destiny that was tied to the land of Israel, and even though that it was just his dead body that was going to go there, and 400 years later, after it's been embalmed, 400 years, still that is my destiny, that I'm connected to the covenant land. Take my bones back there and bury them in the promised land. And also in that same story, when Joseph says, I want Jacob to be brought, I want my daddy to be brought down here to live in Egypt during the rest of the famine, during the rest of the time when there's no food in the promised land, that Jacob had a hard time making that decision. Even though that was his beloved son, and even though that he wanted to be with him, and even though it was a miracle that he was still alive, and he thought, man, this is God's fulfillment, and he wanted desperately to be there, he was afraid to leave the covenant land. He got to the border. God had to appear to him personally and say, it's okay, go ahead and cross. And he went to Egypt. When the Israelites were left in Egypt for the 400 years, and they came under slavery, they lost the covenant promise. No one was depending on that covenant promise. And I can imagine it. To read the promise, to hear the promise that said, everyone that curses you will be cursed. And they've been cursed by the Egyptians. They've been beaten by the Egyptians. They've been enslaved by the Egyptians. And they say, this thing ain't working. It's not working here. God is not cursing these people, even though they're cursing us. And this is going on for generation after generation. Finally, when we get to the book of Exodus, the Bible says, God remembered his people. They didn't remember him. They didn't remember his promise, but God remembered the promise. And so he sent Moses to bring them out. The interesting thing is that at that point, we see something new happening. And instead of it being the promise being to an individual, we read that the promise is to the entire people of Israel. When they're coming out of the land of Egypt, under Moses' direction, they, make the golden calf, and remember they sin against God and all that. And God is saying, okay, I had it with these people. I'm done with them. And then Moses steps in and he intervenes, and he reminds God of the covenant he made with Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. Notice that he only speaks of 3 individuals that were the covenant heirs. And then he speaks of the children of Israel, because The covenant has passed from being to an individual, it's passed to the entire nation of Israel. He says that, and then he speaks of the children of Israel. He tells them, however, God tells them that the covenant now is tied to obedience. You have to obey the 10 Commandments and the laws that I give you from Mount Sinai. And, before, it was just the fact that you were the chosen son. Jacob, tremendous example. He did not abide by any law, okay, but he was still the chosen son. God, from this point on, says, now you have to abide by my laws, by my covenant laws, if you're going to have my covenant blessing. And the interesting thing here is that the reason that God is doing that with the people of Israel is that he wants them to stand out and to look different. He wants them to be peculiar. He wants them to be significantly different from the rest of society around them. As Andrew would say, they were to stick out like a heel thumb. And God was essentially taking the people of Israel and making them into a giant gospel tract, to where that, what a gospel tract is, a little piece of paper that tells the gospel message. And we see the gospel message condensed into one little piece of paper. God was taking the people of Israel and making them unique, making them special, making them particular, and blessing them so that everybody around them would look at them and say, there's something different about those people, and it's the relationship they have with God. And so they were called, in the book of Isaiah, on 3 different occasions, they were called the light to the Gentiles. Because God's plan wasn't just to bless them, but to bless them so that they could be a blessing to the world. God told Abraham from the very first day, he said, I'm going to bless you, and through you shall all the nations, all the families of the earth be blessed. So, if we trace it through, we see that in every great empire throughout history, God always had a testimony of himself, and it was always through the Jewish people. But the thing that happened is that characteristically throughout human history, all the nations have decided to curse the Jews. And because they cursed the Jews, they were cursed. Everyone that blesses you shall be blessed. Everyone that curses you shall be cursed. And we went through some of the story of how that different Gentile nations oppressed the Jews. And every time that the Jews are oppressed, every time that the Jews are cursed, then something detrimental happens or destructive happens to the nation that has oppressed them. And then I think that we spent a considerable amount of time going through what we call the diaspora, the time when the Jews were scattered away from Israel. The Romans kicked them out in 70 A.D., and said you can't live in the land of Israel. There were only just a very small remnant of people that remained in the land of Israel for the next 1900 years, and until 1948 when God allowed the people to come back. 2 great world wars had to occur to set the stage for the return of the people of Israel. World War I, and we'll talk a little bit more about that today, set the stage by releasing the land of Israel from 300 years of control by the Ottoman Turks, putting it in the hands of Europeans who were, Christian, at least in philosophy, if not in practice, but put it in the hands of Christians that then opened up the door for the Jews to come back. And then World War II set the conditions that made the Jews want to come back. Even though the land was granted to them after World War II, most of the Jews didn't have any real desire to come back. It was only after that they were totally plucked up from their positions in Europe that they said, well, now we have a desire to go to Israel. I mean, Israel was not an interesting place, and we're going to read to you a description of what Israel looked like at the time that we're talking about. It was not the fertile land it is today. It was not the developed country. It was a desolate place. And so they said, well, why do we want to go there? And so they didn't go there until that they had nowhere else to go. And after the Holocaust, after World War II, after the Nazi occupations, they had lost their homes. And even if they could go back to their homes, they didn't want to, because, there's a difference between a house and a home. And what is it that makes a house into a home? It's family. It's love. And when all of their family had been killed in the concentration camps, then they said, well, I have no real desire to go back to this place. I want to go somewhere else and start totally fresh, start totally new. And so that set the stage. It also encouraged the nations of the world, because when the nations of the world saw those black and white grainy films that were released about what was actually going on in the concentration camps, the nations of the world said, man, we need to do something for these people that have been so horribly treated. And so the nations of the world, wanted to help to reestablish the nation of Israel. But we had come to the point to where I had mentioned to you that there was a prophetic nature to all of this, and that Daniel had given prophecy that totally depicted everything that was going to happen even before the nations that were involved were birthed. And we all know the story of King Nebuchadnezzar, who has a dream. And he can't remember the dream, and he's ready to execute everybody on his advisory staff because they've all pretended to be so wise and so spiritual and have all wisdom and all knowledge. And so he says, well, I had this dream, I can't remember it, and by golly, if you are not able to discern it for me, then you must be imposters. And so I'm going to execute you all. And so about that time, Daniel shows up and he says, hey, let's not execute anybody, including me, until I have a chance to see if I can interpret the dream. And so he goes and asks God about the dream. And so he comes back to the king and he says, well, what you saw was a statue. Oh, yeah, that's right. I saw this statue, and it had a golden head, and it had the shoulders, a chest of silver, then it had a belly of brass, and it had legs of iron, and it had feet with toes that were a mixture of clay and iron. And he says, now what you saw was the upcoming nations of the world. And the first nation that we're talking about, our first empire, is your empire. And of course that's a good way to start any kind of interpretation. Man, you're made out of gold, you're worth gold. And so Nebuchadnezzar, is really interested in that, because he's the best, he's the most valuable, he's the supreme, he's the head, and he's gold. And then he says, and then after you is going to come another empire that's going to be silver. Silver is not as valuable as gold, and so therefore it's going to be inferior to you. And then after that, it's going to come one that's made out of brass, and it's even less significant as silver. And then finally, one that's going to come out of iron. And so he prophesied upcoming empires. Your empire, the empire of Babylon, followed by the empire of the Medo-Persians, followed by the Greek Empire, followed by the Roman Empire, which is exactly how history played out. Then Daniel had a dream or a vision of his own. And in that dream vision, he saw the same empires, but he saw them now depicted as animals. And the first one was a lion with eagle's wings. And that was not difficult to interpret at all, because that was exactly the symbol of the Babylonian Empire. And so obviously, we don't have to have any spiritual discernment to figure that one out. Then he says the next empire that he saw was a bear. And he says, and the bear, as it was walking, one side was higher than the other one. one shoulder was lifted up over the other one. And he says that depicts an empire that is going to be kind of a combination of two, but one force is going to be a stronger force than the other one. And that would be the next empire that came immediately after the Babylonians, the Medo-Persians. And the Persians were stronger than the Medes. It was a combined empire with two ethnic groups ruling, but the Persians were the stronger than the Medes. And he said, and that bear also will have in its mouth three ribs, depicting the three great cultures or great civilizations that they will take over. And they took over the Egyptians, the Assyrians, and the Babylonians. Three great cultures or civilizations that they conquered. Then the next one, he said, that I see is a leopard or a cheetah. Cheetah is the fastest animal on land, right? And so he says, I see this leopard, and in addition to being a fast-running leopard, it has also 4 wings, and it moves quickly. Well, that would be the next empire that arises, which will be the Greek Empire. The Greek Empire, under Alexander the Great, conquered the then-known world by the time that Alexander was 30 years old, 33 years old, I think it was. And he died sitting, crying, because he says there's no more empires to conquer. He was like the fastest land animal. Even as just a young man, he'd conquered all the empires of the world. And he says, and there's nothing else to conquer. Now, one interesting thing about Alexander the Great is that he did something that would be totally unexpected and totally unacceptable by any other standard. Anybody else would have said, look at everything I've conquered, everything I've accomplished, and I want to continue it. I want to maintain it. I want to make sure that it becomes a legacy and it becomes perpetuated. And so therefore he would have appointed one very strong person to take his place after his demise. Alexander the Great said, this is such a big empire that I have established, I'm actually going to divide it 4 ways. And he chose 4 of his generals and gave each one of his generals a different part of his empire. So that when he died, he actually, instead of continuing the great Greek Empire, broke it into 4 smaller pieces. Okay, that's going to be significant when we get to the next vision that we see. And then he says, following that is going to be the Roman Empire, and that is a horrible beast. It is depicted as something grotesque that you really can't really relate to any other animal that you've already seen before, some kind of monstrous sort of thing. And it says that he's fierce, he has teeth of iron, and he's chewing up everything, and he has big paws, big feet, and he's stomping everything. And that's depicting the Roman Empire. Now, going back to the fact that the Roman Empire in the statue vision was seen as the legs of iron is kind of interesting because the Roman Empire was indeed a very strong empire of iron. But how many legs do you have? 2. The Roman Empire actually divided itself into 2 different divisions, exactly like he saw in the vision, because the Germanic tribes that were coming out of Germany, called the Goths and the Visigoths, they were coming and they were trying to invade, and they were threatening Rome. And so Constantine said, I'm going to establish a second capital in the place that we know today as Istanbul, but throughout history was known as Constantinople. He said, I'm going to establish a second capital so that if the Goths and the Visigoths do come down out of Germany and they do conquer Rome, which they eventually did, we will have a backup that will be outside of their their path of invasion. And so we actually wound up with two Roman empires. The Eastern Rome, which was in Constantinople, and the Western Rome, which was in Rome. And that's where we get the Roman Catholic Church, and we get the Greek Orthodox, Russian Orthodox, and all those other Orthodox churches that basically came out of the Eastern Division, which was in Constantinople. But that's a whole other story for a whole other class. So, but in both of the visions, the dream that Nebuchadnezzar had and the dream that Daniel had, in both of them, we see one more element. And that element is a final division of 10 aspects. The statue, had the legs, and at the feet were 10 toes. The last beast, the fourth beast, the Roman Empire, had 10 horns. And so we see there's a division that comes out to where there are multiple divisions, but yet they are part of or some way connected to the Fourth Empire, even though they all are indicated as being autonomous. Each toe is an individual toe, each horn is an individual horn, but they're still somehow connected to the Fourth Empire. All throughout history, there has been one attempt after another to rebuild the Roman Empire. And every attempt has been a weak attempt. And it was depicted in the statue by being a mixture of iron and clay, so that it didn't mesh, it wasn't strong, it would crumble apart, iron and clay mixed together. And Charlemagne, in his time, tried to build rebuild the Roman Empire, and was crowned as the Emperor of the Roman Empire. Otto the Great in Germany tried the same thing. Napoleon tried it. Chancellor Bismarck attempted to rebuild, and he built what was called the Holy Roman Empire. Wilhelm the Great had the attempt, had the vision, and then during World War II, Mussolini and Hitler both thought that they would try to reestablish the Roman Empire. Wilhelm was called Kaiser, which is actually the German form of Caesar. And so there was attempt after attempt to rebuild the Roman Empire. However, in current history, in 20th century history, there were two more attempts to rebuild the Roman Empire. And one of them, interestingly, occurred in May of 1948. Does anybody know what else happened in May of 1948? The birth of the nation of Israel. Exactly at the time that Israel was being born, there were 750 delegates from different European governments who met in The Hague to try to forge a unity between the European nations to rebuild the Roman Empire. And then in 1957, the nations of Europe gathered in Italy, in Rome, on Capitoline Hill, which is exactly where the capital of the Roman Empire sat, and established what we call the European Economic Community, which was the forerunner and eventually became known today as EU, the European Union. And so this gives us an exact picture of what Daniel saw. Daniel saw or Nebuchadnezzar saw it, and Daniel interpreted it. He saw independent nations that were all independent, but they were still united in some way. The European Union, they're all independent nations, but they are still united together under one treaty or one common bond. And they all see themselves as the end result of what used to be the Roman Empire. So it's an outgrowth of that. Now, there's another thing that happens in this vision, and Daniel sees in the vision that there's one horn, or one of the you remember 10 horns, and one of them rises up, and it becomes a prominent feature. But then he had another vision, and this vision would be in chapter 8. And in chapter 8 he saw a vision in which that there was a battle between two animals. One animal was a ram that had 2 horns, and the other was a goat that had 4 horns. And when these two animals fought, the goat with the 4 horns was the one who won the battle. But now, remember that we talked about the Medo-Persian Empire, and the Medo-Persian Empire was a combination of 2 forces, the Medes and the Persians. And he says, that's who this is. This is the emperor of Medo-Persia. And so, it shows 2 horns depicting the 2 forces. And then remember we talked about the Greek Empire under Alexander the Great, that he divided his kingdom or his empire 4 ways, and had 4 men who became his generals, who became his successors. And so the goat representing that attack is, with 4 horns, represents Alexander the Great and his 4 emperors, or his 4 generals. Now, one of those horns becomes a dominant force. And when we study the history of the Greeks, 2 of the kingdoms, 2 of the divisions of the empire that Alexander the Great left behind become very significant in biblical history, or Israel's history. And that is because that the division between 2 of those, or the boundary between 2 of those divisions, went right through Israel. There was one king or one general who was given authority in Egypt, and that became the kingdom of the Ptolemies. There was another that was given authority, and his seat of power was in Damascus, and he became the Seleucids. Okay? And the boundary between those 2 went right through Jerusalem. And there was a constant battle between those 2 divisions over who's going to control Jerusalem. So they were going back and forth and having war after war, having battle after battle, and they were all occurring in Israel and in Jerusalem. And when we get to the story of the king of the north and the king of the south, the little horn that he sees depicted, those events are described in the book of Daniel in chapter 9. And I don't want to take the time to read all of it, but if you have the textbook on page 72, there is an outline that goes through, chapter 11. I think I said chapter 9. In chapter 11 of Daniel, he goes through step by step the battles and the confrontations between the king of the north and the king of the south. And if you look in the textbook, you see that everything in this book, everything that he talks about, everything that he sees in this vision, everything he prophesies, relates exactly to something that happened historically. And I have like 3 pages of an outline in here showing you step by step how everything that Daniel saw actually was fulfilled. That is, up until we get to verse 36. And in verse 36, we begin to see things that he talks about that didn't happen historically. That's because that those are visions, those are prophecies of things that are still yet to come. The point being that the man Antiochus Epiphanes, who was the king of the north, had in him a spirit. And the prophecy is really talking about what that demonic spirit is going to do, not so much about what the physical man did. The demonic spirit accomplished point after point after point through Antiochus Epiphanes. However, once Antiochus Epiphanes was off the scene, the spirit continued to live. And that demonic spirit will accomplish what he set out to do later on in history through a man that we all know of as the Antichrist. Antiochus Epiphanes was probably the best example of the work of the Antichrist. Because he determined to eliminate every religion and make everybody come under his rule, under his theology, under his philosophy. And I think we mentioned it already, that he came to Jerusalem knowing that the Jews wouldn't fight on Saturday, that the Jews didn't believe in working on Saturday, and he attacked the city and took the temple on the Sabbath when all the Jews just didn't resist him. And so he just marched in and he took it. And then he demanded that they sacrifice pigs on the altar in Jerusalem, the most despicable thing that could ever happen to a Jew, to touch a pig, much less sacrifice a pig, and much less be in the temple and on the altar of God. And so he totally wanted to just destroy everything. And in fact, his name was Antiochus, and he added the title Epiphanes because that means essentially the same thing that we have when we say that Jesus is Emmanuel. It means, essentially God in me, God present through me. And so he came totally intending to destroy the Jewish people and destroy the Jewish faith, made a horrible bloodbath. Now, Daniel also has, in chapter 9, another word from God. And God tells him that the history of Israel is determined in 70 weeks. And when he says the 70 weeks, we understand that those weeks were not weeks of days, but weeks of years. So he tells us that there's really a division, that there are 69 weeks, and then there's a 70th week that seems to be distinct from the other weeks. Well, the first 69 weeks, if you count them in years, that gives us 483 years. And it was 483 years from the time that Israel came back to rebuild the temple after they came back from the Babylonian captivity until the time of Jesus, the 483 years historical period. But there's something interesting that it says, that it tells us that the temple will be destroyed at the end of the 69th week. And then it says, and during the 70th week, that sacrifices and oblations, sacrifices and drink offerings, will be eliminated. Now, I got to ask you a question. How can you have sacrifices and oblations if the temple's already destroyed? If there's no temple to have the sacrifice in, then how are they still having sacrifices? So you got to say, duh, we must have the possibility of rebuilding the temple before the 70th week. So you are not Coloradans, so this will be a little more difficult to explain than it does when I'm talking to the school in Colorado. When you're out hiking in the Colorado mountains, and you're climbing up one mountain and you can see the other mountain behind you, and you think, oh man, I'm almost where I'm going. But it's not until you get to the top of this mountain that you can look down and you can see the valley in between the two mountains. And you say, whoa, I'm not nearly as close as I thought I was. And so now you got to climb down the mountain, through the valley, and up the other mountain. And what looks like it's pretty close as you're climbing up the first mountain turns out to be a long distance in between. God has a way of doing that when He gives us prophetic words. And He gave us a prophetic word here telling us that there's a 69th week, but then He gives us an indication that, hey, at the end of the 69th week, the temple's going to be destroyed. But then when we get to the 70th week, the temple is obviously in operation again. And what happened is He hid a 2,000-year pause button in between that we didn't see because we were just looking at the mountains and we weren't looking at the valley in between. So the 70th week is a prophetic week that's still yet to come. And it will not initiate until the temple is rebuilt. And we'll talk about that again in another class as we get a little further along. But the first 483 weeks are depicted bringing us up to the time when the Messiah appears, when Jesus comes. And then after that, then we have a time when that there is, we're still waiting. Okay, then point number 10 on page 18 says the final conflict of Israel will be Israel versus the Antichrist in the 70th week. And the Bible talks about that the Antichrist, or the little horn, is going to make a covenant with the people of Israel. I believe that we'll see as we go through the next set of prophetic events why that covenant will happen. But the people of Israel want to make a covenant with the Antichrist. And when they make that covenant, it says things are going to go well for the first half of the week. But in the middle of the week, he's going to break that covenant. And the reason being is that the Antichrist will say, hey, the people in Israel have finally rebuilt a temple, and golly gee, I think I'm God, and so I ought to be worshipped in that temple. And at that point, then they're going to say, no way, Jose, and they're going to break the covenant, and then all hell breaks loose. When we go through this final 3.5 weeks of Holocaust, this final 3.5 weeks of horrible, demonic oppression and demonic manifestation, finally Jesus appears. And when Jesus appears, then that's the thing that we've all been waiting for. And the Apostle John describes that for us in the book of Revelation, chapter 19, beginning in verse 11. And I saw heaven opened, and behold, a white horse, and he that sat upon him was called Faithful and True, and in righteousness he doth judge and make war. And his eyes were a flame of fire, and on his head were many crowns. And he had a name written that no man knew but he himself. And he was clothed in a vesture dipped with blood, and his name is called the Word of God. And the armies which were in heaven followed him upon white horses, clothed in white linen, white and clean. And out of his mouth goeth a sharp sword, that with it he doth smite the nations, and he shall rule them with a rod of iron. And he treadeth the winepress of the fierceness of the wrath of the Almighty God. And he hath on his vesture and on his thigh a name written, King of Kings and Lord of Lords. And I saw an angel standing in the sun, and he cried with a loud voice, saying to all the fowls that fly in the midst of the heaven, Come and gather yourselves together unto the supper of the great God, that you may eat the flesh of kings, and the flesh of captains, and the flesh of the mighty men, and the flesh of the horses, and them that sit upon them, and the flesh of all men, both free and bond, both small and great. And I saw the beast and the kings of the earth, and the armies that gathered together to make war against him that sat on the horse and against the army. And the beast was taken, and with him the false prophet that brought miracles before him, with which he deceived them that had received the mark of the beast, and them that worshipped his image. And these both were cast into the lake of fire, burning with brimstone. And the remnant were slain with the sword of him that sat upon the horse, and which sword proceeded out of his mouth. And all the fowls were filled with their flesh. And God's people could say, Amen. God is going to send Jesus to destroy the forces of the Antichrist that will rise up in the last days to try to undo God's covenant promise that He's given to His covenant people and to His covenant land. God will see that it is given back, and it will become the throne upon which Jesus will sit, and the nation from which He will rule all the nations of the world. And all God's people said, Amen. All right, God bless.